You know, usually when you picture a pristine wildlife expedition, there's a very specific expectation. We all have that perfectly framed National Geographic shot in our heads. You imagine trekking through a lush, untouched rainforest. The canopy is glowing, this vibrant, almost impossible green, and your guide just points and whispers, "There it is."
Right, yeah, it's like the ultimate escapist fantasy. I mean,
Yes.
we deeply want to believe that nature exists as this completely untainted sanctuary,
Yeah.
like a world entirely separate from our messy human life that we can just step into, quietly observe, and then step back out of without leaving a trace.
Yeah, exactly. But, then you step into the actual physical reality of modern wildlife observation, and suddenly that beautiful, lush backdrop just evaporates.
Right.
What you're looking at instead is a landscape that is, honestly, jarring. So, welcome to the deep dive. For you, the learner listening right now, today's mission is to unpack a profoundly thought-provoking paradox in modern travel. We are looking at how our absolute best intentions, our desire to be, good travelers, might actually be blinding us to an environmental reality unfolding right in front of our binoculars.
It really is a critical paradox to examine, and we're grounding today's conversation in a deeply unsettling yet brilliant piece of writing by Roberta Hill from Wander After 70. It's titled The Landfill Horizon: The Paradox of Modern Ecotourism. And this source doesn't just critique travel itineraries. It essentially demands that we completely reevaluate what we are actually seeing when we interact with nature today.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Hill starts with an image that completely shatters that lush rainforest fantasy we just talked about. She describes the literal, physical reality of modern eco-travel. We are talking about bird watchers, photographers, tourists with these high-end $1,000 lenses standing right next to garbage dumps,
Right.
waste sites, the industrial edges of cities.
And it's vital to emphasize here that this isn't a metaphor. They are literally standing at the edge of active landfills.
Yeah.
And the mechanism behind this is incredibly stark. It's not that these tourists took a wrong turn, right? It's that human trash is increasingly the only reliable food source left for these specific wildlife populations.
Wow.
Yeah, the birds are there because, well, that is where survival happens now.
And the part that really stopped me in my tracks is how thoroughly this has been normalized by the travel industry. Hill points out that a cruise excursion that literally buses people to a dump gets marketed in the brochure as a rare birding opportunity.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, eco-tour operators sell it as unique wildlife access. You have travelers posting these highly dramatic, gorgeous close-ups of rare birds circling over literal mountains of plastic, and the captions are all boasting about sustainability and connecting with the wild.
It is a total masterclass in cognitive dissonance.
Uh-huh.
We are staring directly at the byproduct of mass consumption. But because a rare bird happens to be eating it, we frame the experience as nature. And to really understand how bizarre this modern phenomenon is, Hill contrasts it with how nature observation used to function.
Right, the Colombia anecdote.
Exactly. She draws on her own travel experiences, specifically a trip to Colombia. She booked 2 private birding tours. One was a waterfowl tour on the coastal waters of Cartagena, but it's the second one that really illustrates her point. It was a trip to a nature reserve outside of Bogota.
And by today's hyper-curated, Instagram-ready standards, this Bogota trip was a complete disaster. It was a misty day. The guides knew there were incredible species all around them, but they simply couldn't see them through the heavy fog.
Right, visibility was 0.
Yeah. On top of that, Hill felt seriously unwell, couldn't hike the planned distance, and they actually had to abort the tour halfway through. She saw almost no birds. But she notes that she spent a long, quiet time just watching a single hummingbird.
Exactly. And her conclusion about that aborted, misty, seemingly unsuccessful trip, she writes that it was absolutely worth it. Because historically, birders and nature enthusiasts inherently accepted uncertainty.
Yeah.
You might sit quietly in a hide for 6 hours and see absolutely nothing but wet leaves. And that wasn't considered a failed tour or a reason to ask for a refund. That was just an acknowledgement of how nature works. Nature did not owe you a sighting.
Wait, hold on. I got to push back a little here on behalf of the modern traveler. If I am spending thousands of dollars and flying across the world specifically for an eco tour, isn't a guaranteed sighting exactly what I'm paying for? I mean, time is limited. People want to know they're going to get the experience they saved up for.
That is exactly the modern mindset Hill is critiquing. And you're right, it's driven by economics and limited time. But we have to look at how that guarantee is manufactured. To fulfill that intense consumer demand for certainty, tour companies basically have to commodify rare species.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they can't rely on the whims of a misty morning anymore. So locations of specific birds are tracked and shared online with what Hill calls military precision.
Which completely changes the ecosystem itself. It's not just passive observation anymore.
Precisely. Let's look at the actual mechanism of what happens when a rare bird is tagged on one of these tracking apps. Within hours, a crowd descends. You have dozens of photographers playing recorded bird calls on their phones to lure the animal out of hiding.
Wow, that's intense.
It is. This directly stresses the bird, causing it to burn precious calories it desperately needs for migration or reproduction. Its natural nesting areas get trampled by people just desperate for the shot. Eventually, the entire flock's feeding patterns shift to avoid the harassment.
And where do they go?
To the industrial edges. To the landfills, where the ecotourists then follow them.
It's like booking a table at a Michelin star restaurant, but then being seated out back in the alley next to the dumpster because that's where the stray animals are eating. And the tour guide acts like you've been given an exclusive chef's tasting menu, and we just accept it.
I have to ask you listening right now, have you ever felt that pressure, that intense urge to get the guaranteed sighting on a trip? You paid the money, so nature better perform on your schedule.
Right. And because we demand that scheduled performance, we end up standing beside the landfill. But this realization demands a pivot. We can't just critique the tourist. We have to look at the broader ecological diagnosis. If we accept that the birds are at the dump, we have to look critically at the structural forces that force them out of their natural habitats to begin with. Right, which takes us away from just the where and into the why. Now, we all know the old concept of the canary in the coal mine, the early warning system where miners used birds to detect toxic gases. But Hill bypasses that cliche and looks at a much more profound historical example, which is the Chernobyl disaster.
Yes. In the aftermath of Chernobyl, scientists didn't just walk around with Geiger counters to measure the fallout. They looked to the sky. They closely monitored the local bird populations, tracking minute changes in their reproduction rates, tracking how their migratory route suddenly shifted, and documenting physical deformities.
So they're basically using the birds as a proxy for the radiation.
Exactly. The birds acted as a living, breathing map of unseen radiation damage drifting through the forests. What's fascinating here is how Hill maps that Chernobyl example directly onto the flocks of birds circling our modern landfills.
So what does this all mean?
Well, those landfill birds are the exact same kind of warning system. But because they are finding food, we mistakenly view them as a sign of nature's resilience. We tell ourselves a comforting story that nature is bouncing back. But Hill argues they are a flashing red light. They are a glaring warning about disappearing wetlands, shrinking forests, and oceans that are warming so fast that traditional food sources are just collapsing.
That makes a lot of sense. Are we so distracted by snapping the perfect dramatic close-up that we completely miss the fact that the animal's only there because its actual home just burned down?
It's a complete misreading of the data right in front of us. And we see this misdirection constantly, particularly in how we talk about wildlife diseases. Hill highlights the recent panics over diseases like the hantavirus jumping from wildlife to humans.
No, absolutely. Every time a new study comes out, there's a massive media panic about catching something from a bat or a rodent.
Right, and notice how that conversation immediately gets framed. It instantly becomes about fear, border containment, and subtly blaming the animals for encroaching on our spaces. But focusing purely on the virus is like obsessing over the color of the smoke while actively ignoring the fact that the house is on fire.
Because the fire is habitat destruction.
Exactly. These birds and rodents aren't suddenly deciding to migrate toward human populations and waste sites because they developed poor judgment. They are environmental refugees. We have systematically paved over, polluted, or clear-cut the ecosystems that naturally sustain them. Hill summarizes this with a line that really anchors her entire thesis. Nature isn't returning. Nature is improvising.
Nature is improvising. That really sticks with you. It's making do with our garbage because we took the wetlands. But, if the ecosystem is actively collapsing and these animals are essentially refugees, how on earth did well-intentioned eco-tourists become the primary audience buying tickets to watch it fall apart? If I book a sustainable tour, aren't I supposed to be the good guy?
This is the crux of the modern eco-tourist's contradiction. Hill is very careful, and we should be too, not to paint these travelers as cartoon villains. They aren't.
Right.
They are generally highly educated, thoughtful people who actively want to make ethical choices. They deliberately book small group locally owned tours. They avoid the massive polluting diesel buses. They happily pay a premium because the brochure says sustainable.
She specifically mentions the reusable water bottles. She says ecotourists carry them like moral badges. And honestly, I felt slightly attacked by that. I definitely carry my dented, sticker-covered Hydro Flask everywhere like it's a shield that tells the world, hey, don't worry, I care about the Earth.
We all do it. It's human nature. But let's look at the psychology behind that water bottle. It acts as a moral loophole. It's very similar to the psychology of ordering a diet soda with a massive triple patty fast food meal.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that tracks.
The human brain uses that one micro-good deed, the diet soda or the bamboo straw, to subconsciously grant itself permission to commit a macro harm, like taking a transatlantic flight to a fragile ecosystem. We start to believe our good intentions mathematically cancel out our physical impact.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because when you apply that psychology to an entire industry, the destruction doesn't stop. It just gets a rebrand. It becomes much more subtle. Can you walk through exactly how a remote location gets transformed by these good intentions?
Yeah, it happens through a very predictable step-by-step economic domino effect. Let's say there's a remote coastal village with a pristine, untouched mangrove forest. A single travel influencer visits, posts about this hidden, untouched gem, and suddenly you have an influx of ethical travelers.
Right, because everyone wants to see the untouched gem.
Exactly. Well, those travelers need infrastructure, so the village builds a small dock. Then they need to accommodate shuttles from the airport, so a road gets widened, which requires clearing trees. Then come the parking lots, the visitor centers, the flushing toilets.
And the concrete platforms specifically designed so people can safely get their photos without getting their boots muddy.
Exactly. And the runoff from that new parking lot slowly degrades the mangrove. The wildlife starts to recede. But now, the village's entire economy is completely dependent on those tourists coming to see the wildlife. So what happens? They start artificially feeding the animals to guarantee they show up for the 10 a.m. shuttle.
Jeez.
The local ecosystem is no longer wild. It has been fundamentally altered to serve as a performance for outsiders.
That is wild. We literally engineer the wildness out of it so we can comfortably observe it. And Hill points out that this contradiction peaks with the cruise ship industry. You have these colossal vessels, which consume just an unfathomable amount of resources to operate, sailing into fragile fjords.
Yeah.
And while the ship is burning heavy fuel, thousands of passengers are sitting inside an air-conditioned, plush auditorium, listening to an expert give a lecture on marine conservation. Then they all disembark, load onto 50 idling buses, and drive out to observe the very wildlife their ship is displacing.
It's quite the paradox. Now, in fairness to the tourism industry, they are not the sole architects of habitat destruction. Systemic government failures, mass industrial agriculture, unchecked consumerism, they all carry massive portions of the blame. But tourism possesses a uniquely dangerous psychological power. It is incredibly efficient at turning a damaged place into a consumable experience.
Which completely shifts how we process what we are seeing. Hill argues that this industry makes us remarkably skilled at emotionally normalizing environmental decline.
We see this mechanism operating across all sectors of modern travel. Look at how disaster and poverty are commodified. Extremely impoverished slums are transformed into walking tours. Cities that are buckling under the sheer weight of over-tourism get rebranded by algorithms as must-see hidden gems.
Yeah.
Actual disaster zones become highly sought-after photo opportunities.
Yeah.
And environmental decline, the loss of habitat, that simply gets packaged and sold as educational ecotourism.
And the language they use to sell it is doing so much heavy lifting. Hill lists some of the actual terms that tour companies use in their marketing materials. Adapted habitat, urban wildlife interface, human-animal interaction zones. It's like putting a warm, nostalgic vintage Instagram filter over a photograph of a horrific car crash and then rebranding it in the gallery as avant-garde dynamic metal restructuring. We're looking at a toxic landfill and calling it an adapted habitat.
It's incredibly effective marketing, but ecologically it's devastating because that language gives us permission to look at a tragedy and actually feel virtuous for witnessing it. It shields us from the grief of what we've lost.
Yeah.
But as Hill bluntly notes, sometimes a dump is just a dump, and those birds circling the methane vents aren't majestic symbols of nature's unconquerable resilience. They are desperate, starving animals sounding an alarm we refuse to hear.
So if you're listening to this right now and you're someone who genuinely cares about the environment, you are probably feeling a massive wave of frustration. I know I did. Because the logical conclusion here feels paralyzing. If our very presence, even with our bamboo utensils and our good intentions, is driving this cycle of destruction, what do we do? Do we just stay home? Do we cancel every trip, lock our doors, and refuse to travel so we don't accidentally fund another concrete viewing platform in a wetland?
Hill anticipates that exact reaction. It's the natural response when you realize your footprint is heavier than you thought. But her answer is a definitive no. Retreating entirely is not the solution. Travel still serves a vital human purpose. It shatters our echo chambers, exposes us to different ways of living, and forces us into proximity with uncomfortable global truths.
But wait, if travel is inherently destructive to these habitats, how can she justify continuing to do it? Isn't that just her letting herself off the hook?
It's a fair critique, but we have to look at the economic reality on the ground. The truth is, many legitimate, crucial conservation projects around the world are entirely financially dependent on tourism revenue. If the ecotourists stop coming tomorrow, the funding dries up. And when the funding dries up, the land doesn't return to a pristine state. It gets sold to the logging company, or gets taken over by poachers, or it gets paved for mass agriculture. Tourism is often the only economic shield these places have.
Okay, so the solution isn't absolute purity, because in a globalized economy, purity is basically impossible.
Precisely. The goal isn't to achieve zero impact. The goal is to exercise profound restraint. We have to collectively accept that not every single beautiful place on Earth needs to be visited by us. Not every fragile ecosystem requires human footprints to validate its existence. And critically, not every wildlife sighting needs to be extracted, captured on a phone, and turned into content for our social media feeds.
Right. And just because a tour operator uses earthy green fonts and photos of people wearing cargo pants in their brochure, that doesn't mean they deserve our automatic moral approval. We are so easily manipulated by the aesthetics of sustainability.
This raises an important question, or rather, a framework for how we evaluate our choices. Hill suggests that responsible travelers need to actively interrogate the systems they are participating in before they ever hand over their credit card. We need to look past the marketing and ask, who is actually profiting from this excursion? Is the money staying in the local community, or is it being funneled to a multinational corporation?
We also need to ask what physical changes had to occur in that ecosystem just to make our visit comfortable. Did they have to clear-cut a forest to build the lodge?
And perhaps the most revealing question, if humans weren't here, would these animals be behaving this way? Are we quietly observing natural behavior, or are we watching wildlife that has been trained, fed, or displaced to accommodate our viewing schedule?
Are we witnessing conservation? Or are we just witnessing nature's desperate adaptation to our damage? That is the question you really need to ask yourself next time you're hovering over the Book Now button for a sustainable excursion. Are you actually looking for a genuine, messy, unpredictable connection with nature, or are you just spending money to buy a clean conscience?
Those are difficult, deeply uncomfortable questions. And Hill doesn't pretend to have found some state of perfect enlightenment. She admits she still travels, she still takes cruises, and she still loves seeing wildlife.
Right.
But what she is proposing is a fundamental philosophical shift in how we understand our role in the world. We have to completely abandon this simplistic, binary idea that there are good travelers and bad travelers.
Right. The idea that the person on the massive luxury cruise ship is the villain, while the person backpacking with their bamboo cutlery and reusable water bottle is the hero.
Exactly. That distinction might make us feel better at dinner parties, but it is entirely too simplistic for the complex ecological reality we're actually facing. Instead, we have to develop the emotional and intellectual maturity to sit with contradiction. We have to learn to stand in two conflicting truths at the exact same time. Travel expands our worldview. A&D travel inherently degrades the places we visit.
Ecotourism provides critical funding for conservation. A&D ecotourism relentlessly commercializes the fragility of the planet.
A group of birdwatchers can possess a deep, profound love for avian life. And the physical presence of those same birdwatchers can push a species further toward the brink. Being a responsible traveler in the modern age is no longer about collecting a series of ethical labels to prove to everyone that you're one of the good ones. It's about recognizing your impact, exercising restraint, and fully embracing the discomfort of those contradictions.
Okay, let's step back and look at the whole picture we've painted today. This has been a massive, much-needed reality check. The overarching takeaway is that nature isn't just bouncing back to some pristine state. It is desperately improvising to survive the world we've built. The historical canary in the coal mine has been replaced by the rare bird circling the methane vents of a city landfill. And our intense, consumer-driven desire for guaranteed, perfectly curated, aesthetically pleasing, ethical experiences is creating a blind spot. We are watching the house burn down, but because the fire looks beautiful on camera, we are praising the warmth of the frames.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought to consider moving forward. We spent a lot of time discussing the mechanism of how tourism is remarkably effective at turning disaster zones, displaced wildlife, and damaged habitats into profitable, highly sought-after experiences.
Right. The slum tours, the concrete platforms in the dying wetlands, the excursions to the landfill.
So, if that economic mechanism is true, what happens when the financial incentive to maintain the disaster attraction actually outweighs the desire to fix the underlying environmental problem? Think about it. If an entire local economy, from the tour guides to the hotels to the shuttle drivers, becomes completely dependent on showing international tourists how rare birds survive at a toxic landfill, there is suddenly zero economic incentive to actually clean up that landfill or restore the original wetlands. If we successfully figure out how to commodify and sell the end of nature, do we lose the very incentive required to save it?
Wow. If the disaster itself becomes the product, then fixing the disaster ruins the business model. That is a heavy, essential thought to sit with, and honestly, it changes how I'll view every travel ad I see from now on. And that is exactly what we set out to do today, to push past the earthy green fonts, the marketing spin, and the reusable water bottles to expose the real underlying mechanisms of how we interact with the world around us. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking those hard questions, keep embracing the discomfort of learning, and remember, the next time you demand that nature perform for you on a guaranteed schedule, you might just find yourself booking a table at a Michelin star restaurant only to realize you've been seated out back in the dumpster. Catch you on the next one.